Today we begin our fourth and final session on the Liturgy of the Hours. The first session dealt with theology and structure of an hour. Second section we dealt with the geography of the book, how the book is put together and laid out. Our third session was about the liturgical year, which is the roadmap that tells us what to use in that book. And our fourth session today will be on how music is used in the Liturgy of the Hours. Because the Liturgy of the Hours is so fundamentally based on psalmody, the Psalms make up the greatest part of the text for the Liturgy of the Hours. We're going to talk a little bit about Psalms and the Hebrew poetry that is involved in the Psalms. The book of Psalms in the Bible is considered the hymnal of the Bible. There are 150 songs. The word psalm itself means praises. Comes from a Hebrew word translated into Greek, and that Greek word has to do with music, and that's how we get our word for the psalm, the song, the poetry that makes up a part of our Christian worship. In Hebrew poetry, unlike English poetry, which has a definite rhythmic structure, a pattern, a meter, as it were, and very often a rhyme scheme, which makes it interesting to our ears, Hebrew poetry is not like that at all. There's generally no meter, there's no recurring pattern in the accented syllables of words, and there's also no necessarily rhyme at the ends of lines. But there is a structure to it. There's a structure that's called parallelism, where ideas are what make up the structure of Hebrew poetry. In terms of parallelism, there are three kinds of parallelism. I'll give you an example of each of those. Synonymous parallelism is when two or more lines reiterate the same idea. For example, in Psalm 100, verse 5, it says, "Good indeed is the Lord. His mercy endures forever. His faithfulness lasts through every generation." So in the second and third line of that excerpt, you see that you have synonyms. His mercy in the second line and his faithfulness in the third line are synonyms. Endures and lasts are also synonyms, and then forever and through every generation are synonymous. So you've got two lines that really say the same thing in different ways, and that's a way that the ear can be tuned to that kind of structure in Hebrew poetry, and you can take delight in that, just like we take delight in the rhyme scheme in English poetry. There's also another kind of parallelism called antithetical, which is just the opposite of that, because what will happen is one line will state an idea, and the next line will state the opposite idea, or something that's antithetical to the first line. An example of that comes in the Magnificat from Luke. He has cast down the mighty from their thrones and has lifted up the lowly. So the opposite concepts of the mighty and the lowly in two successive lines. Another example from the same canticle. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. So two antithetical statements that are parallel to one another. So that's the second example of parallelism, antithetical. And then the third example, the third style, would be something that we might call progressive, where one line develops an idea that's stated in the previous line. And an example comes from Psalm 19. "The law of the Lord is perfect. It revives the soul. The rule of the Lord is to be trusted. It gives wisdom to the simple." So you see that the second and fourth line amplify what has been said in the first and third line. That's progressive parallelism. So that's a brief description of Hebrew poetry and how you might appreciate what you find there. In terms of music in the hours, there are various parts of each hour where music is either demanded or at least highly suggested. Obviously, one of them is the hymn that happens in each of the hours. There's always a hymn. This is the particular point in Catholic liturgy where a hymn is called for, unlike where we find a lot of hymns these days in the Mass. There's very few hymns that are specified in the Mass, and they are specified for specific days. The hymn Pange Lingua is specified for Holy Thursday during the procession at the end of Mass, and that's in the rubrics, that hymn to be sung. Other than that, hymns are not really meant for Mass. Hymns are designed in Catholic liturgy to be sung at the hours, the divine office. So the hymn is a place where music is going to happen. You can also, in more solemn celebrations of the hours, sing various other parts. You can sing the psalmody with the antiphons that go before and after each of the psalms. And you can also sing the gospel canticles. And if you are extremely fancy and very solemn, you can sing the other parts, the introduction, the conclusion, the Lord's Prayer. So there's many places during the hours where music can occur. That music can take various forms, and we'll discuss and hear examples of some of those forms. The oldest of those forms is called Gregorian psalm tones. These were devised to be used with the Latin divine office, the Latin breviary, where monks or priests would chant the office, generally from side to side, antiphonally, and they would use various psalm tones that were based on the modes that developed in Gregorian chant. You have modes that are similar to scales in our modern terminology, but these modes all sounded different one from another. There are 8 modes plus an extra mode called the pilgrim mode, and there's a psalm tone that is based on each of those modes. These work extremely well for Latin psalmody because of the structure of Latin words, where the syllables fall, what kind of endings happen or don't happen on Latin words. So the Gregorian modes are well suited for chanting in Latin. For example, Dixit Dominus Domino meo, sede ad extris meis, is an example of a psalm phrase using one of the psalm tones in Latin. These are also it's also possible to use these in English. They don't sing as well as they do in Latin, but it's possible to use them. And you have in your handout a page that outlines all 8 of those Gregorian psalm tones plus the extra tone at the bottom called the pilgrim tone, the tonus peregrinus. Let me sing for you some of these. Some of them are going to be very familiar, and we use them often. Some of them are less familiar. I'll sing Psalm Tone 2 for you. And as I sing this, you should note that there are actually 3 parts to each of these psalm tones. There's a part at the beginning that's marked optional, and that's called the flex. The reason that it's optional is that in the Psalms, oftentimes they can be divided into groups of 2 lines, various groupings of 2 lines all the way through the psalm. But sometimes there's a 3rd line that is thrown in. And if there's a 3rd line in a particular stanza or a section of the psalm, then you would use all 3 of these measures of the psalm tone. If there's not 3 lines, then you skip the first one. That first one is called a flex. The second one, if you're using all 3, the second one's called a mediant, meaning the middle. And the third of those is called the termination, meaning the end. So if I were to sing Psalm Tone 2 all the way through, using all 3 sections, there's no text there for you, but I'll just make something up for you. This is how you sing the flex. This is the mediant. This is the termination. So that's how you would sing text to that psalm tone 2. And if I didn't have 3 phrases, I would skip the first part, the flex, and just sing, this is the mediant. This is the termination. So without the flex at the beginning. Psalm tone 5 is fairly familiar. And it sounds like this. This is how you sing the flex. This is the mediant. This is the termination. So you find that almost all of these have a similar flex. The differences on these psalm tones happen at the very beginning and at the termination. Psalm tone 8 is probably the most famous of the psalm tones. You hear it often. It sounds like this. This is how you sing the flex. This is the mediant. This is the termination. Common and often used. And then finally you have the bottom tone on the sheet, the tonus peregrinus, which is a little more elaborate than the others. It sounds like this. This is how you sing the flex. This is the mediant. This is the termination. So that's an example of 4 of those 9 psalm tones. One of your pages also has the Canticle of Simeon, which is the gospel canticle for night prayer, outlined in Psalm tone 8, and it would sound like this if I sang part of this. Lord, now you let your servant go in peace. Your word has been fulfilled. My own eyes have seen the salvation which you have prepared in the sight of every people. A couple comments about that. You only use the very first 2 notes, the initial notes, on the first section of the psalm or the canticle. So those 2 notes I only sang on the word Lord now. And after that, I just go back to the reciting note. That's the long whole note that has the bars beside it, where most of the text is sung. That's called the reciting tone. I go back to the reciting tone on all the other sections of this canticle. This canticle is pointed, which means that the text is marked so that you know where to move to the mediant and where to move to the termination. The mediant is indicated in this particular pointing system with italic style text. In the first line, it's on the word go, so you know that go is the note that you move up off the reciting tone to the mediant. And the termination is indicated with a bold underlined word or syllable. In this case, it is the word word, and that's where you move off the reciting note again to the termination. And if the text is pointed, it's very easy for a congregation to follow along. It's a little more difficult if it's not pointed, but it's still possible, especially if they know the tone very well. So those are the oldest style psalm tones. I believe in the 70s, maybe the 80s, a style of singing psalmody in English was developed at St. Meinrad Abbey. These are also modal tones, meaning they're based on the 8 church modes, but they're meant for singing in English, and they're meant to be accompanied. The Gregorian psalm tones, the older ones, are generally sung a cappella, although you can use a light organ accompaniment, but most often they're sung without accompaniment. The Meinrad tones are most often sung with accompaniment, and we use those quite frequently at the church here. They are what you see on your next 2 pages of the handout, and as you might expect, there are 8 of them to match up with the 8 church modes. Some we use often, some we use less often. I'll play you through some examples of these, and you'll probably be able to recognize a few of them. The first tone that I'll play is tone 3, and I'm going to use, just because it's in front of me, the text from Psalm 95. And generally what happens if these are accompanied, as they usually are, the organist will play through all 4 measures of this tone before anyone sings. Come, let us sing to the Lord, and shout with joy to the Rock who saves us. Let us approach him with praise and thanksgiving, and sing joyful songs to the Lord. The beauty of these tones is, first of all, they're very well suited for singing in English, and they also allow a music director or a choir director to set any text. So any particular psalm text that we want to sing, any responsorial psalm, any other liturgical text, is very easily adapted to one of these tones, and we have a way to sing that without writing out music in a metrical form. You notice that in the Meinrad tones, as differentiated from the Gregorian tones, which have 3 parts, the Meinrad tones generally have 4 measures, 4 parts. Again, the beauty of these is that they're very adaptable. If you have only 3 lines in your stanza of the psalm, you leave one of these measures out. In this case, you would leave measure 3 out, and it would sound like... If you have only 2 lines on your psalm stanza, or if you're singing an antiphon that usually divides into 2 parts, you sing only the first and the 4th measure. So again, they're very flexible, adaptable, and you can sing a great number of liturgical texts using the Meinrad tones. Sometimes in psalmody, you actually have a stanza or a section of the psalm that is more than 4 lines. Psalm 95, for example, the 2nd stanza is 6 lines long. And then you run into a difficulty. You can either repeat one of the 4 measures if you're only using the 4-measure version of the tone, or the Meinrad chants actually have 6-measure versions of all 8 of the tones. So there's a way to sing that middle part when you have 6-line stanzas. The Meinrad tone 5 has 6 parts to it if you need them, and they sound like this. Composer did was take the general 4-measure psalm tone and in the very middle added 2 extra measures. And in this case, this is one of my favorite 6-measure psalm tones, because right in the middle he adds the 2 extra measures that sound like this. They start on an open 5th, meaning there's no distinguishing 3rd in the chord to make it a major or a minor chord. It's just an open 5th. And he goes to that tone and then adds the major 3rd, and then moves to the submediant, which is the 4th chord in the scale, which is a very it's a beautiful passage there. So I like that. Let me sing you Psalm 95's 2nd stanza using the 6-measure Meinrad tone 5. The Lord is God, the mighty God, the great King over all the gods. He holds in his hands the depths of the earth and the highest mountains as well. He made the sea, it belongs to him, the dry land too, for it was formed by his hands. So that gives you a way to sing a 6-line stanza of a psalm. The final Meinrad tone that I want to play for you is probably the most famous, the most easy for our modern ears to hear because it's not as modal as the other ones are. It tends to stick to a major sound a lot. It's tone 8, and it sounds like this. Come then, let us bow down and worship, bending the knee before the Lord our Maker. For he is our God, and we are his people, the flock he shepherds. So that's tone 8 in the Meinrad style. There are some other tones that were written more recently than the Meinrad tones, but they are very similar in style to the Meinrad tones because that format of chanting the Psalms is so useful and so flexible. Other composers, piggybacked on that idea. There are some pieces of music that are written specifically to use for morning prayer and evening prayer. They're published by Cantica Nova Publications, a company I'm intimately involved in. And actually these are my own settings of tones that can be used to sing morning prayer and evening prayer. And we do use them at the church here, especially on Wednesday nights when we do solemn evening prayer as part of Holy Hour. I'll play 2 examples of those. They are on your next 2 pages in your handout, your booklet. One of them is called the Benedictus tone, and it is obviously used to sing the Gospel Canticle at morning prayer, the Benedictus. It sounds like this. It would be, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel. He has come to his people and set them free. He has raised up for us a mighty Savior, born of the house of his servant David. There's a tone then in those particular books that can be used for each part of the psalmody. The first psalm is generally sung to this tone. The second tone to a psalm in a different psalm tone in a different key. And finally, in evening prayer, the New Testament canticle in another key. There's a tone for the responsory. And then at evening prayer, you would have the Gospel Canticle sung all the way through to its own special tone, which sounds like this. My soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has looked with favor on his lowly servant. Now you'll notice there that since that first stanza only has 3 lines in it, I skipped measure 3 of the tone on that particular stanza. Other stanzas, most of the others that have 4 lines, would of course use the entire tone the way I played it first. There's another style of psalmody called Anglican chant, another style of psalm singing called Anglican chant, and that was obviously developed in the Anglican Church, and it is eminently suited to English, and it is similar to the Gregorian tones, except it has a more metrical style to it. It's a little more set apart in metered accents, and it sounds like this. Sing to the Lord a new song, sing to the Lord all you lands. And that's an easy way to chant the Psalms in evensong that you might find in an Anglican cathedral. You'll hear a lot of that style of chanting the Psalms by the choir. And then the last thing that we'll do for our session today is take a look at one of the required portions of evening prayer, which are the Marian antiphons that occur at the end of night prayer. It calls for one of the Marian antiphons to be sung to conclude night prayer, and there are 4 of those that are traditionally associated with the liturgical year. The Alma Redemptoris Mater is sung from Advent through Christmastide and all the way through February 2nd, which is an older ending to the Christmas season. You have the Ave Regina Caelorum, which is taken up at that point and goes all the way through Lent. The Regina Caeli is the Marian antiphon for Eastertide, and the Salve Regina is the Marian antiphon for ordinary time, after Pentecost until you get to Advent again. So again, we have a little review of our liturgical year in this last session. I'll sing just the beginning of each of those antiphons, and you will likely recognize them. Alma Redemptoris Mater, que per via celi porta manes, et stella maris. So that's how the Advent Christmas antiphon begins. The Lenten one starts, Ave Regina Caelorum, Ave Domina Angelorum. The one for Easter, Regina Caeli letare, Alleluia, quia quem meruisti portare, Alleluia, resurrexit sicut dixit, Alleluia, ora pro nobis Deum, Alleluia. I sang that whole one because it's the shortest one. It's very easy to sing, and it's actually my favorite. And then the last of these, which is sung most often during ordinary time, is the Salve Regina. Salve Regina, Mater misericordiae, vita dulcedo, et spes nostra salve. And you'll know that as the Latin version of the prayer that you say at the end of the Rosary, the Hail Holy Queen. That's how that came about. And that concludes our 4th and final session of the Liturgy of the Hours. I hope that these sessions have helped you on your journey toward praying the hours, and that you find some inspiration and do pick up this official prayer of the Church. May the Lord bless us, protect us from all evil, and bring us to everlasting life. Amen.